Hello guys, my name is Paulo Martel, I'm from Portugal, and this is my assignment for week 1 of the Introduction to Audio Music Production course at Coursera.org. So, what is exactly timbre? Well, in rigorous terms, it can be defined as the quality of a musical sound that distinguishes different types of sound production. In a more colloquial way, we can say that timbre is that quality that allows us to distinguish different instruments when they play the same musical note. So for instance, if I play a note on the piano and the same note on the flute and yet the same note on the violin, we can both tell that this is the same note that's been playing, so the three notes are in tune. But at the same time, we can also tell that the notes are being played by different instruments. That quality that allows us to distinguish the three instruments, it's timbre. So musical sounds have both timbre and frequency or pitch. But what are they exactly, musical sounds? Well, one might say that they are periodic waves that have a characteristic frequency, and the musical pitch is just the human perception of that frequency. For instance, here I have the wave shape of a trumpet sound, and I have highlighted one cycle of such wave, and this cycle is the unit that repeats itself over and over and very fast, in this case 440 times per second. There are two distinct aspects of timbre that we need to consider. The first one is the spectrum, which describes the distribution of energy among the different frequency modes or sign components or partials that make up our sound. And the second is the envelope, which describes the variation in sound intensity and spectral content along time. So one might say that the spectrum is a more static quantity, while the envelope is a dynamic property that evolved a long time. The concept of spectrum is closely related to the work initiated by the French mathematician Jean-Baptiste Joseph Fourier, who showed that any periodic waveform can be written as a sum of sine waves. So for instance, the sawtooth wave that I have depicted here can be seen as a sum of all these sine components that you see, in this case 5, and as you can see, they approximate the shape of the sawtooth. In this animation, you can see how the different sine components, as they are added to each other, approximate better and better the shape of the sawtooth wave. Now, why is this Fourier result so important? Well, if you consider any musical sound wave, however complicated it may be, it can always be produced by adding up simple sine components like I have here. I have these three sine waves of progressively higher frequencies, and as you can hear, they sound rather dull, but when I add them together, I produce a much more interesting sound. Actually a sound with a totally different character. So by adding up these sine waves, I'm producing a new timbre. Let's now consider the much more complicated sound wave of a trumpet. In this case, you need many more than 3 sine waves to produce the wave shape. And these sine waves have to have different intensities as well. When you plot the intensities of those sine wave components against their frequency, you get what is called a frequency spectrum. You see that all these sharp peaks in the spectrum are the individual frequencies of the sine components that we need to adapt to produce the trumpet audio wave. Here I'm showing 4 examples of frequency spectra, where the first example is the simplest kind of frequency spectrum that we can have, that of a sine wave with just one sharp peak corresponding to the frequency of the wave. And then notice how in both in the flute or the trumpet spectra you have very clearly separated sharp peaks corresponding to the partials, while in the last spectrum, that of a noise sound wave, you have a much more continuous or homogeneous distribution of peaks throughout the frequency range without really having any separated or sharp peaks. The temporal evolution of sound is a very important part of what we perceive as timbre. Therefore, we need to consider the way sounds change over time. Like for instance, here I have as an example the change of the frequency spectrum of a piano note over time. As you see, as time passes, the relative ratios of the different partials are changing, and so are the intensities. Aside from spectral content, the way sound intensity changes over time is also another important part in what we perceive as the pitch of a sound, the timbre of a sound. So for instance, the sound of a piano has a very sharp attack or a burst of intensity at the beginning that makes it appear as a percussive sound, while the sound of a violin has a very soft attack in the beginning. And so part of the difference in the perception of timbre of these two sounds is related to these differences in amplitude envelope. Okay guys, I'm reaching the end of my talk, so I would like to conclude with some remarks. First, musical timbre describes the flavor of musical sounds, and as we have seen, it depends on a number of factors, including spectral content, spectral envelope, and amplitude envelope. Finally, I would like to point out that understanding how timbre is formed is really important in music production, sound design, and sound engineering. Generally speaking, in all of these fields, it's very important to understand how the sound of different instruments is produced and what components it has in them. For instance, to make sounds sit better in a mix, to create new sounds, or to just know how to use the sounds that exist in the best way to produce a musical composition.